It was a chilly evening in late autumn when the McKinley household settled into its usual rhythm. In the quiet of their suburban home, all was calm, save for the soft tick-tock of the wall clock in the living room and the occasional rustling of fallen leaves outside. James McKinley, a man in his mid-40s, was unwinding after a long day at the office. He sank into his favorite armchair, the one that had witnessed years of stories, laughter, and quiet moments, and sighed in relief. Next to him, his faithful companion, Max, a golden retriever with a coat like the sun itself, lay curled up at his feet. Max had been James' partner through thick and thin. When James had moved to this town years ago, Max had been his only friend. Over time, they'd become inseparable. Max was more than a dog. He was a protector, a confidant, and often, James' emotional anchor. That evening, however, James felt something he couldn't quite shake, an odd, deep sense of discomfort. He had been feeling a little off all day, but it wasn't until he leaned back into the chair that he realized the fullness of it. A dull ache in his chest, a pressure that seemed to grow heavier by the minute, crept in. It wasn't like the typical fatigue he was used to after a long day of work. This was different. This was more sinister. Max, who had been dozing lazily, suddenly lifted his head, his dark brown eyes locking with James, for a brief moment. His ears perked up, and the hairs along his spine bristled. There was something in the air, something that James couldn't yet understand, but Max had already sensed. James winced slightly as the pain in his chest worsened, but he dismissed it. "I'm just tired, Max," he whispered, his voice raspy. "Nothing to worry about." But Max wasn't convinced. With a low growl deep in his throat, he stood up and padded over to James, placing his head gently on James's lap. Max's eyes widened with concern. He knew something was wrong, though he couldn't yet understand what. The animal instincts that ran through him told him that James needed help, but Max didn't know how to fix it. The ache in James's chest was now spreading, radiating down his left arm, cold and sharp like ice. His breathing became shallow, almost as though it took every ounce of effort to draw air into his lungs. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, irregular and erratic. In that moment, James knew something was terribly wrong, but he couldn't bring himself to call for help. Then Max did something he'd never done before. With sudden urgency, he began pawing at James's leg, his nails scraping the fabric of the chair, a series of rapid, frantic motions. His eyes were wide, locked on James, as if he understood that time was slipping away, and fast. James was too dazed by the pain to react immediately. His head began to swim, the room around him swirling in and out of focus. But Max wouldn't stop. He kept pawing and nudging at James with more intensity than ever before. The dog's bark, usually soft and playful, had turned into a series of loud, insistent yelps, each one breaking through the thick fog of James's mind like a blinding light. "Max, calm down," James muttered weakly, unsure of what was happening but trying to reassure the dog. But Max was relentless. The barking grew louder, more frantic, more desperate, as though he could sense the danger closing in on James. His head whipped back and forth between James's face and the door to the hallway, as though beckoning someone to come. The urgency in Max's eyes was undeniable. He wasn't just a dog anymore. In that moment, he was James' only hope. James's body was beginning to shut down. His vision blurred, and he could no longer focus on Max's face. But through the haze, he could hear the barking, louder and louder. It was a sound that seemed to break through the suffocating fog that had settled over him. Somewhere in his dazed state, he realized what was happening. He was in trouble. He needed help, and quickly. The thought barely registered before it faded from his consciousness once more. But Max wouldn't stop. The dog began jumping up and down now, desperately pushing against James' chest with his paws. Max was trying everything, clawing, barking, and pawing until the sounds reverberated through the entire house. And it was then that something miraculous happened. The sound of Max's frantic barks echoed through the walls, waking up Sarah, James's wife, who had been in their bedroom, reading. She shot up in bed, disoriented but quickly aware of what was going on. There was no mistaking it, the barking was different. Something was wrong. She bolted out of bed, sprinting toward the living room, where she found Max jumping on James' lap, his barking now a desperate, frantic wail. Sarah froze for a split second, her eyes scanning the room until they locked onto James, slumped in the chair, his face pale and his breathing labored. "James," she cried out, rushing to his side. Max immediately stopped barking and instead began circling, pacing anxiously around the room, as though waiting for her to do something, to make it right. The realization hit Sarah like a ton of bricks. Her heart pounded in her chest as she dropped to her knees beside James. The heavy weight of fear settled over her as she pressed her hand against James's chest and felt the irregular rhythm of his heartbeat. She didn't know how long she had. But she knew it wasn't long enough. "Call 911. She screamed at the top of her lungs. Max was still pacing, but his body seemed to sag slightly, as though his own energy was waning. Sarah grabbed her phone from the table, dialed the emergency number, and as the operator answered, her voice was a mix of panic and clarity. "My husband's having a heart attack," she shouted. "I need help, now." Meanwhile, Max stood by, watching with a gaze that was both resolute and sorrowful, his eyes locked onto James. It was as though he understood the gravity of the situation, and that, in the end, he had already done all he could. As the paramedics arrived and rushed James to the hospital, Max stayed behind. The dog seemed to know that his work was done, but that didn't make the quiet that followed any easier to bear. Max lay down by the door, his head resting on his paws. His chest rose and fell with a labored sigh. But something in his movements slowed, a tiredness seeping into his bones. Little did anyone know that the true test of time had only just begun. The cold, sterile atmosphere of the emergency room felt like a distant dream to Sarah as she clutched the hospital phone, her knuckles white with fear. The sound of the beeping monitors and the frantic shuffling of medical staff felt muffled and surreal. Her heart raced as she watched James, unconscious, hooked up to tubes and IVs. The doctors and nurses moved swiftly around him, but their faces remained unreadable, a mask of professionalism that offered little comfort. "He's stable for now, Mrs. McKinley," one of the doctors finally said, his voice calm, but his eyes betraying a deep concern. "But we've had to resuscitate him twice in the last hour. His heart is too weak right now. We're doing everything we can." Sarah nodded numbly, her mind whirling. The seconds stretched into infinity. She couldn't stop thinking about how close she had come to losing him. How close they had come to losing him. If Max hadn't acted when he did. She glanced down at her phone in her hands, the last few moments before they had left the house replaying in her mind. Max's barking, frantic and loud, tearing through the house. Her running into the room to find James slumped in the chair. And then the silence that followed as the paramedics rushed James into the ambulance. The quiet that had fallen over the house, broken only by the faint echoes of Max's desperate cries. Back at home, Max had been left alone in the living room. Sarah hadn't thought to look at him before leaving, but now, she regretted it deeply. She was so focused on James, on saving him, that she had completely forgotten about their loyal friend. "I should have called the vet," she thought, pacing the hallway, her mind a storm of guilt and worry. Max had always been there for them. There for James when no one else had been. He had stood by Sarah's side through the loneliest nights after their move. And now, when it had mattered most, he had been the one to wake her up to the danger before it was too late. He had done what no one else could. But where was he now? Back in the emergency room, Sarah was pulled from her thoughts as a nurse approached her. "Mrs. McKinley," the nurse said gently, "you may want to come with me." Without hesitation, Sarah followed the nurse down a few hallways until they arrived at a small waiting area near the back of the hospital. There, standing under the harsh fluorescent lights, was Dr. Harmon, the head of cardiology. His face was grim. "We've been able to stabilize your husband, but there's still a long road ahead," Dr. Harmon said, pausing before continuing. "He had a massive heart attack. It was a miracle that you were able to get him to the hospital in time." Sarah's heart lifted slightly at the words miracle, but it quickly sank again. She couldn't relax. "Not yet. I know it's hard, but I have to be honest," Dr. Harmon continued. "Even with the intervention, there's a very real risk of another heart attack. His heart isn't strong enough yet. We're putting him in an induced coma for now to let his body rest and hopefully heal. The next 24 hours will be critical." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She fought to keep her composure. "Can I see him?" she asked softly. Of course. But we ask that you limit the time you spend with him. We need to keep him calm. She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. As they walked toward the ICU, Sarah's mind was racing. Could she really lose him? Could Max's instincts and his courage, in the end, not be enough? When she was finally allowed to sit beside James, she placed her hand on his, gently stroking his palm. He was still warm, but he looked so fragile, his chest rising and falling under the careful machinery that helped him breathe. She wanted to speak to him, to tell him everything would be okay, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't know if it would be. Meanwhile, a few miles away, back at their home, the scene had taken a darker turn. Max lay in the living room, his head resting heavily against the floor, his breathing shallow. Sarah had neglected to notice it at first, how sluggish Max had become, how quiet the house had felt after her hurried departure. But as she remembered the way Max had acted, the way he had pawed at James, her heart sank. She had left him behind in her panic, in the rush to save James. The silence now felt unbearable. The vet, a kind woman named Dr. Clara, had arrived at the house soon after Sarah called. She found Max in the living room, lying motionless by the door. His usually bright eyes were dull, and his breathing was faint, but he managed a soft, weak whine when he heard Dr. Clara's voice. His tail twitched a little, but it was obvious that the dog was exhausted, more than just physically. It was as if the fight had left him. "Max?" Dr. Clara said gently, crouching next to him. "Hey, buddy, what's going on with you?" Max's eyes flickered up to hers, and there was an almost unspoken understanding between them. His gaze seemed to say, "I've done my job, but I don't know how much longer I can hold on." Dr. Clara quickly assessed him, recognizing signs of acute exhaustion and possible heart strain. It wasn't uncommon for dogs to experience emotional distress after such intense moments, and given the stress Max had been under, it seemed that the loyal dog was now running on empty. She had no time to waste. She called the animal hospital, arranging for Max to be rushed in for immediate care. But no one could deny the bond that existed between man and dog, the unique, unspoken connection that was woven into every moment of their lives. Max had given everything to save James, but now, the energy that had driven him to act was slowly ebbing away. The hours in the ICU stretched endlessly for Sarah. She had barely moved from James's side, her hand still gently resting on his. The rhythmic beeping of the machines was a constant reminder of the precariousness of his condition. It was all she could hear, and every time the pitch of the beep would change, her heart would skip a beat in a quiet panic, only to exhale in relief when it returned to normal. She hadn't been able to sleep or eat. All she could think about was how close she had come to losing him. How close they had come to losing everything. But Max, the dog who had been there through thick and thin, had somehow managed to save James with his relentless courage. Max had been more than a pet, he had been family. The thought of him alone at home, struggling, was gnawing at Sarah's soul. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined the look of urgency in his eyes, the panic that had consumed him when he sensed something was wrong. Meanwhile, at the animal hospital, Max was receiving all the care he could. Dr. Clara had done everything she could to stabilize him, but even she could see how weak he was. The once strong, vibrant dog was now lying in a small, quiet room, IV fluids running into his body to help keep him hydrated. But his spirit was fading, and with every passing hour, it was becoming more clear that Max was running out of time. At the same time, back at the hospital where James lay, the night was still young, but the clock on the wall ticked steadily onward. Sarah had just taken a moment to close her eyes, her body heavy with exhaustion, when the sound of a doctor's voice jolted her awake. "Mrs. McKinley?" It was Dr. Harmon again. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" She sat up, her heart racing. "Was something wrong?" "I'm afraid we've run into some complications," Dr. Harmon said, his face a little more strained than before. "James's heart is still weak. We were able to stabilize him for now, but there's a high risk that another attack could happen, or that his heart simply won't recover." Sarah felt a cold wave wash over her. It was as though the world had tilted sideways. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "But we are doing everything we can," the doctor continued, his voice gentle but firm. "There's still hope. We've arranged for a procedure to implant a temporary pacemaker, to help stabilize his heart and give it a chance to rest. It's a big step, but it could help. Sarah nodded numbly, trying to absorb the information, but it felt like her mind was moving in slow motion. Hope. She had to hold on to hope. That's what Max would want. He had given everything to make sure James had a chance. She had to keep that same faith. Please, Sarah said, her voice cracking, just do everything you can. Please. He's my world. He's the love of my life. Dr. Harmon gave a solemn nod. We'll do our best. As the doctor turned to leave, Sarah returned her attention to James. She gently stroked his hand, tears welling in her eyes. He looked so peaceful, so vulnerable. She couldn't imagine a world without him. And yet, just a few hours ago, it seemed as if he had been slipping away from her. Max had saved him, Sarah thought, her heart swelling with both love and guilt. Max had given his all to make sure James survived. And now he was in pain. Unable to sit still any longer, Sarah rose from her chair, her mind made up. She needed to see Max. She needed to thank him, to tell him that everything would be okay. She didn't care how much time she had to spend in the hospital, nothing would stop her from seeing her dog. Her loyal, brave dog who had saved the love of her life. She made her way to the front desk, asking for directions to the animal hospital. The receptionist nodded and handed her a piece of paper with the address. On the way to the car, Sarah's mind was swirling with fear and hope, uncertainty and determination. As the car sped through the streets, she held tight to the belief that Max had been the catalyst for all of this. Without him, they wouldn't be here. Without him, she might have lost James forever. Minutes later, Sarah arrived at the animal hospital, her heart hammering in her chest. The receptionist greeted her with a warm, sympathetic smile. "You're here for Max?" "Yes, please," Sarah said urgently, trying to keep her voice steady. "How is he?" The receptionist led her through the hallways, to a small, quiet room at the back. There, lying on a soft blanket on the floor, was Max. His eyes flickered open as Sarah entered, and a small, weary tail wagged. His body looked frail, his fur matted in places, but his eyes still held that familiar warmth and loyalty. Sarah knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she stroked his golden fur. "Max, you did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved him. You saved James. I don't know how to thank you." Max let out a soft whine, his body shifting slightly. He nudged his nose against Sarah's hand, as if to tell her that he was okay. He was tired, yes, but he was still here. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she leaned in and whispered, "I'm so sorry I left you, buddy. I didn't mean to." Max's tail wagged weakly, but he lifted his head slightly, his eyes looking up at her with an almost profound wisdom. It was as if he understood her apology, understood her heartache. He had done his job, and now he was ready to rest. He had given everything to protect James. Now, he only wanted to know that his family was safe. "I promise you, Max," Sarah said, her voice steady but filled with love, "I won't let you down. You'll always be a hero to me." Max let out a final, soft sigh, his eyes slowly closing as he nestled his head into the blanket, his body completely relaxed. Sarah stayed by his side, holding his paw in hers, the bond between them now more profound than ever. Back at the hospital, things were looking up for James. The pacemaker had been successfully implanted, and his heart rate had stabilized. The doctors were cautiously optimistic that the worst was behind them. But Sarah knew the true reason her husband was still alive. It wasn't the pacemaker. It wasn't the machines or the doctors. It was Max. Max had given everything to make sure James had a chance. And, as Sarah held her beloved dog's paw one final time, she knew that he would always be a part of their family's heart. And so, Max passed away quietly, a true hero in every sense of the word. But in that moment, Sarah found peace, knowing that she had been blessed with a friend who had saved everything she held dear. As she stood up, wiping the last of her tears away, she whispered, "Thank you, Max. You saved us." And somewhere deep in the heart of the home they had shared, the gentle echo of a dog's love remained. A love that would never truly fade.